Friends, it's time that we have a very serious chat. All of us would be lying if we said we didn't notice that social media has resulted in more and more people becoming more and more radicalized and not in a good way, in the conservative way. Is social media causing you to be more conservative? In this video, I hope to explore how outrage culture, parasocial relationships, and social media pair together to fuel conservative ideology. First, what is outrage culture? You might be familiar with the term cancel culture. In fact, I do have a podcast called Uncancel Culture, and although I've explained it already, cancel culture is not real. However, outrage culture, which is often referred to as cancel culture, is. This video is going to be broken down into four main segments. The first is going to be outrage culture and what it does to you psychologically. The second is going to be parasocial relationships and how that shapes your beliefs. The third is going to be how social media algorithms push you to be more polarized. And the fourth, of course, is going to be the Overton window and how that shifts society towards a decay in human rights. Outrage culture is something that happens in both left-leaning and right-leaning spaces on all corners of the internet. It is the public shaming, moral grandstanding, and performative activism of it all. Actions like dogpiling, public call-outs, call-ins, online harassment, insults, slurs, group frustration, groupthink in general, all of these things fall under the umbrella of outrage. In right-leaning spaces, this is framed sometimes around free speech. The outrage around things like free speech is prominent in pretty much all discourse in right-leaning spaces, and they also put a hyper-emphasis on cancel culture and sensitivity and why that's wrong. You may also be familiar with people like Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson and their hyperfixation on woke mobs. One prominent example is Dave Chappelle. When he was called out for transphobia, Fox News covered this as a violation of Dave Chappelle's free speech and how freedom of speech is under threat. Another example of outrage culture in right-leaning spaces is the frustration with critical race theory, which ironically violates freedom of speech in a way because it stops children from learning about their history and it prevents teachers from teaching it. But if you let certain conservatives tell it, it is a indoctrination method used to bring children closer to Marxism. I mean, hey, I don't really see anything wrong with that. Also, ironically, they were upset when Dylan Mulvaney, a trans woman, got a brand deal with Bud Light. I guess freedom of speech ain't so free after all, because it depends on who you are. Also, please do not get me started on how upset people in conservative spaces become when you mention LGBTQIA plus people in Disney. My goodness, the freedom of speech crowd, again, really do not care too much about freedom of speech. And make no mistake though, this is not something that the left is exempt to. The constant conversation around Beyonce and who she is as a performer, what she represents to people, what it means that she is classified as a billionaire, what it means to consume her art, whether it's Kendrick Lamar, his Super Bowl performance, which was amazing by the way, and what it means to consume art and whether or not that's revolutionary. Oftentimes on the left, it is framed around the idea of accountability. Think Ellen DeGeneres and how her show was literally canceled because people were outraged because it came out that she may or may not have mistreated her employees. According to some, she didn't live up to the nice facade that she built up in the public, and that was enough to get her up out of here. I ain't saying it's wrong, but this outrage is addictive. For starters, outrage triggers the brain's reward system, and when you participate in outrage culture, you experience dopamine hits. This can create this high feeling that causes people to seek out more outrage. Not to mention that outrage can give you a sense of empowerment. Participating in outrage culture can make you feel more powerful as a person, which psychologically impacts you and makes you want to do more of it. There's also the aspect of social connection. When you are outraged and you share that outrage with a larger group of people, you feel connected and you feel a sense of community. Is that community built around literally shaming and belittling and berating other people? A lot of the times, yeah. I think there's a better way. Outrage also triggers a stress response. This can leave a person in fight or flight, and this heightened emotional state can make a person feel more alert and present, so that could lead to them being addicted as well. You also often find yourself siloed into echo chambers where you have people validating you, and this feedback loop makes you lean even more into the outrage. But this part is the one that I want to highlight the most, and that is the escape from complexity. When you experience outrage and you participate in outrage culture, you are offered by outrage simplicity. Outrage offers a simple, clear-cut solution to complex issues and often makes it so that you don't have to have complex, nuanced conversation, which is emotionally easier to handle, which also makes it more enticing. Statistics have shown that tweets that express anger instead of joy are 20% more likely to be shared, and I'm going to take the leap and say that this is something that is true across all platforms, or that arguably could be true across all forms of social media. Statistics also show that moral and emotional language increase the diffusion of political messaging 20% more on social media as well. How does this impact the average person and make them lean more towards conservatism? As I noted earlier, in more right-leaning outrage cultures across the internet, political figures like the Tucker Carlsons and Ben Shapiro's of the world use outrage to manipulate and often galvanize their bases. Issues like the culture wars, snowflakes, you name it. All of these examples are conservative figures using and leveraging outrage in order to gain a social media following and base. Next, I want to explore, though, how these parasocial relationships often built with these influencers also inform your beliefs. To start, though, a parasocial relationship is a one-sided relationship often felt with a celebrity, media figure, or influencer, despite no real interaction, and is normally a deep and meaningful connection. This term was coined in 1956 by sociologists Donald Horton and Richard Wohl, and it was created to discuss the bond between audience member and prominent TV figures. In terms of psychology, people normally see a whole lot of themselves in the influencers that they build parasocial relationships around. Speaking of which, social media has amplified parasocial relationships because more people are accessible. These viewers seeing themselves in these influencers typically result in them projecting their own values, beliefs, and ideas onto the people who they are viewing. And with the consumption of their media, typically this could result in a false sense of intimacy and closeness with the influencer. For example, if it's a TikToker, someone can say because they watch their vlog or they know the ins and outs of their lives that they know for sure who this creator is, even though they do not know this person in real life. Before we even continue, let me say this. I am someone you should question. You should question everyone who you consume, everybody's media who you watch, everyone you follow. It's okay to question them. Question me. You have my permission. That being said, we cannot ignore that parasocial relationships are political. Yes, they are political. Everything is political. I know. Three prominent examples: Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Steven Crowder. These are three individual conservative men who have built their platforms on things like facts over feelings, challenging people, often marginalized people, to debates that frankly are just platforming hateful rhetoric. And some people, especially younger men, view these figures as father-like figures. I know it's open up the schools, Lord. This isn't just something that happens on the right, though. With figures like Hassan Piker, ContraPoints, and this one is a little controversial, but Bernie Sanders. I know he's not like an influencer. However, his presence on social media is a large part of his rise in popularity throughout his career. Argue with your mama, not me. Left-leaning influencers and political figures typically position themselves as being champions for marginalized communities, which is why their audiences typically are made up of predominantly marginalized people or people who care about marginalized people. Relationships thrive on social media, though, because there's a lot more access. There are lives, there are vlogs, people sharing intimate details about their lives, personal stories from their upbringing, you name it, even sharing their opinions. This can lead to people looking at influencers and figures as friends or mentors. I have even at times been on the receiving end of that myself, and it's not always a bad thing. It's just something that, again, you should have a ounce of criticism towards. Okay, but how do these parasocial relationships shape your beliefs? Well, for starters, parasocial relationships often exist within echo chambers. When you find yourself in community with a lot of people who also have parasocial relationships with influencers or figures, they often will do that. Form an echo chamber. That is why it's very important for you to have, again, an ounce of criticism towards everything you consume and be open to hearing different perspectives, not just that of the creators you like, the influencers you like, or the figures you like, but more people outside of that even. It can even be dangerous when the influencer or figure themselves weaponizes this because they know that they have an agenda where they are trying to push people towards a specific direction. Think Ben Shapiro and how often he rejects any beliefs outside of his own. Yeah, or literally Steven Crowder, whose whole thing is change my mind, and he does not want his mind to be changed. He does not want his mind to be changed, let's be clear. And unfortunately, because of some changes in United States policy, we used to have something called the fairness doctrine, where journalists had to share both sides of a story and they were obligated to tell stories from multiple angles in considering all sides of the matter. That doctrine was implemented in 1949, but it was removed in 2011, and we have been very polarized in the media. That has led to a lot of people not trusting traditional media, and a lot of political figures and influencers kind of swooped in and took advantage of that in some cases, and some of them just are viewed as more trustworthy and reliable, often being referred to as truth tellers and the outsiders or the underdogs or the people willing to say the things that nobody wants to say because they shouldn't be said. A lot of these, especially conservative influencers, take advantage of this and use it to pretty much build massive audiences. With that being said, if a political figure has extremist views, they can radicalize their audience members. And that is dangerous because who uses the internet? Everybody, but including kids. I think of PewDiePie and how he would make Yahtzee jokes, and those jokes eventually led to, well, look around you. Emotional bond formed between the influencer and figure and their audience makes it a lot harder for people to challenge them or to think critically when they are receiving information from these people. Again, even me, question even me. Also think of far right influencers like Alex Jones, who promote these super fringe ideologies, and they have become more and more isolated from not only their loved ones but everybody in society. Yeah, it has dangerous and real life implications. Next, I want to focus on how polarization is amplified by social media. First, let's start by defining what an algorithm is. An algorithm is a set of rules that these social media apps use to determine what users see, what they interact with, what goes viral, what doesn't go viral, and what's prioritized, like likes, shares, views, you name it. Some key and instrumental platforms are Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, or if you want to call it the letter child, you do that. That's your business. And of course, YouTube. The reality though is the reason why outrage is prioritized is because evoking emotions like fear and anger are more likely to receive engagement from the people who are using these apps. It is ultimately the job of algorithms to keep people on these platforms as long as they can, so the things that evoke emotion typically keep people engaged and on the platform for longer. Therefore, the things that are more outrageous are typically going to get more of a push. Trust me, I have experienced this more than enough times. A post that is emotionally invoking and purposely polarizing about politics is going to get a lot more play and action than just a bland or basic fact-based video. That's just the reality. People tune in more when they have a reason to be outraged. Then of course there is the role of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is basically the premise that people are going to engage with things that confirm what they believe already, and they are going to avoid things that disconfirm those beliefs. Is disconfirmed a thing? It's going to be one today if it's not. Algorithms typically prioritize showing people more of what they agree with or things that they can be diametrically opposed to get more angry, and then spew more of what they agree with so they can find community with the people who they also agree with. It's a rage cycle. We cannot discount how much these algorithms deepen these political divides. And this division and polarization has consequences too. 62% of Americans believe that polarization has gotten worse over the last decade. This also increases the likelihood of a spread of false information, because false information typically evokes more of an emotion than the truth. People will engage in salacious stuff just because it sounds salacious. It is enough of a provoking post that it is engaged with a lot more than, say, the truth. It is easier to hear, did you know that 2 plus 2 equals 55 now? Versus 2 plus 2 is still 4. Do you understand what I'm saying? Quick maths. Don't even get me started on the COVID-19 vaccine misinformation that was spread on Facebook and other platforms similar. People will never be free. This spread of alternative facts and disinformation also erodes trust that people have in social institutions. Look at WHO, WHO. Look at it. Look around you. But this also brings me to my final point, and that is the shift in the Overton window. To simplify something that's not all that simple, the Overton window is the range of policies, ideas, and beliefs that are considered mainstream at any given time. For example, there was a time period where gay marriage, gay anything, the LGBTQ community at large in the United States was not a part of this Overton window. it was seen as like fringe or taboo. And in recent years, that Overton window has shifted more to the left to include marginalized groups such as the LGBTQ community. It is now shifting even further to the right, where that is no longer being considered safe. Not that it was all that safe when it shifted, because it didn't shift that far to the left. I'm not going to preach. I'm sorry. Back in the day when you wanted to shift the Overton window, this included media, publications, social movement. A really great example in social media was around, of course, during this, but the Black Lives Matter movement really shifted the Overton window to consider police reform in the mainstream. What happens though when social media amplifies fringe and often very radical right-wing political ideologies and beliefs is these more fringe ideas and ideologies seem and appear more mainstream than what they are. Platforming fascism. Yeah, again, look around you. Much like the very awful Jubilee channel that offers up marginalized people to debate and go back and forth with people who literally want them dead, social media gives air not only to these very radical and extreme beliefs, but they also make it seem as if the sensible ones are on the equal footing, and they're not. Like, the more radical beliefs, such as groups of people don't deserve to be alive, those should not be amplified, yet social media does just that. Another example being that climate change is viewed as debatable. There are climate change deniers who are elevated and platformed in the same way that climate change activists and organizers are. That's not, one of these things is going to keep us alive, the other one it's not rocket science, y'all. At the end of the day, political gridlock and polarization around issues like healthcare, gun control, universal housing, you name it, are exacerbated by social media. According to the World Bank, countries that have a high level of political polarization are 50% less likely to pass progressive laws. I know that's a scary word for some of y'all because of people like Ben Shapiro. I promise you it's a good thing to progress as a society. Well, I hate that I have to explain that. Constant outrage keeps people away from being able to engage in productive conversations and ultimately problem solving, which is what we need to do as a society. But when we are so focused on arguing about what is and should not be allowed to be discussed, or should this group of people be alive, or should we actually invest in things like people being able to have houses or health insurance, like we lose the plot. And that's the point. We have to start questioning all of these things. And through the weaponizing of things like critical race theory, it prevents people from being educated to actually have the skills and have the history and context to actually have meaningful conversation and to problem solve. Final question: why does this benefit conservatism a little bit more? Conservative messaging thrives off of simplicity and emotion. Slogans like "Make America Great Again" tap into primal emotions like fear, anger, rage towards systems and what's happening, and it oversimplifies very complicated histories and complicated issues, if you want me to be honest. In contrast, left-leaning messaging and ideology typically revolves around nuance, intersectionality, and systemic change. Those things are not simple. Those things frankly require more logic than emotion. Because of this, conservative influencers dominate the social media space. I know during this last election cycle, a lot of people were confused about why there was such a strong footing for the orange person in office, but the reality is that conservative media, again, relies on simplicity. It relies on your emotions, your outrage, and because of that, it can literally galvanize more people. Where left-leaning influencers in spaces typically challenge people to be nuanced and to consider complexity in history and intersectionality and all of the layers of a person, conservative media and influencers typically encourage people to do the opposite. In fact, they rally people around going against the woke mob or cancel culture. And it doesn't help that we have billionaires playing around in this stuff. Twitter, for example, 74% of people who engage with conservative content get recommended that content by the app itself. Content that centers and focuses on systemic issues does not go viral as often on that app, and I can speak from experience. Conservative and far right leaning ideologies also appeal to the status quo and what people are comfortable with an emphasis on things like social hierarchy, traditional values, and what has always been. It really appeals to people who have a fear of change, which is a pretty innate human thing. Conservative and right leaning talking points typically revolve around fear, encouraging people to be afraid of their fellow people. Emphasizing that there's a threat to people's safety keeps people galvanized and emotionally invested in what it is that they are trying to direct people towards doing, which is ultimately harming themselves and the rest of us. In highly polarized environments, the Overton window shifts to the right. That is because in polarized environments, a lot of the right-leaning influencers and political figures frame progressive policies as radical. Living in a house, having health insurance, radical. Knowing the actual history of this country, radical. Okay, moving on. In closing, a lot of conservative influencers and political figures use outrage as a manipulation tactic, and we are all unfortunately kind of falling into it. Parasocial relationships build trust and loyalty, and that is often manipulated by some of these people. Social media websites typically prioritize things that are going to be polarizing because it generates outrage, which generates engagement, and ultimately polarization shifts the Overton window towards the right. This halts the progress of humanity and degrades human rights. I do not have to go into a whole lot of detail to explain how these things have damaged our society as a whole and continue to put people's lives in harm's way and in danger. But what I can encourage you to do as an audience is, like I said, question me and everyone else, and also think critically, and also consume and seek out diverse perspectives, not just mine, not just people who think like me or you, but try and listen to multiple people. We have to be different than them if we want to beat them. Try your best to focus on constructive dialogue, and I promise you, if someone is hyper fixated on internet drama and beef, they are probably not looking out for your best interest as a person. That's it for me. I hope you like this. Please let me know what you think of the format. I really want to hear your thoughts on the whole topic in general. Please like, subscribe, and thank you for tuning in.